Hello everyone, today we will step back into a time when kings ruled by divine right and punishment could be as cruel as imagination allowed. We stand not in a battlefield or a dungeon, but in the echoing stone halls of a royal court, where one man's whispers would end in the hiss of boiling liquid and the scent of scorched flesh. Imagine the flickering torches casting long shadows on velvet curtains, courtiers murmuring behind embroidered sleeves, and at the center of it all, Richard. A man no one truly knew. A name that entered the records with either past nor kin. A presence as compelling as it was disturbing. Before we get started on this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And when we reach the end, let me know in the comments, was justice served, or was something darker at play? The first time they saw Richard, it was as though the air itself changed. The royal court of England, ever suspicious and tangled in its own games, took notice immediately. He wasn't dressed like a peasant, but neither did he wear the rich layers of nobility. His tunic was of good cloth but plain. His hair was too neatly trimmed, his skin too pale for a laborer. And his eyes, gray, quick, and always just a moment too steady, set nobles on edge before he ever opened his mouth. No one knew quite who had invited him in. One lord swore it was the archbishop's doing, another claimed the queen herself had summoned him as a healer. But Richard denied both when asked, and offered no clear answer of his own. What he offered instead was advice. Advice that worked. Within weeks of arriving, he had earned quiet influence. He predicted the success of foreign trade deals down to the coin. He identified spies by name, and when guards followed his directions, they found sealed letters just where he said they'd be. He whispered to generals before battles. He advised the young prince's tutors to change the boy's diet, and the child's long-feared illness vanished. Some said he had studied in the East, or learned alchemy in Venice. Others were sure he had been a monk before taking to court. No one ever proved either. But still, they listened. Even the king did. Yet power has a price, especially when gained too quickly. It started with a cough. Not Richard's. The queen's uncle, a respected and shrewd diplomat, was the first. One day fine, the next sweating and pale, dead by the third morning. Then came a steward. Then a bishop. A merchant from Florence, known to dine often with Richard, collapsed during Massachusetts. Always the same signs, tremors in the limbs, blackness at the lips, and then stillness. At first, no one dared speak Richard's name aloud in connection. It seemed impossible. He was always so quiet, so clean, so precise. But fear is a fog, and fog spreads. One of the king's men, a captain of the guard, began asking questions. He noticed that the victims all drank from the same flagons, touched the same railings. One maid claimed to have seen Richard in the kitchens, alone, hours before a banquet. That was all it took. Soon, even the nobles who once praised him spoke in hushed tones. Too clever, one muttered. Too quick with answers. Another remembered the strange herbs he kept in jars in his quarters. A knight who owed Richard a gambling debt accused him outright during supper, and though the accusation was dismissed as drunken nonsense, the rumor caught fire. The turning point came when the prince, the very same boy whose health had improved under Richard's guidance, fell ill once more. This time with violent seizures that turned his lips blue. The queen wept. The court panicked. And Richard disappeared. For 3 days he was gone. Not a trace in the royal grounds, not a word to the guards. Then on the 4th morning he returned. Walked calmly through the gates, handed a folded letter to a guard, and asked for an audience. He was arrested before he reached the throne room. They found vials among his belongings. Notes in a language none could read. And a single page tucked in his cloak, listing names, many now dead. He said nothing in his defense. And so the trial was set. But it would not be a trial of law. It would be one of fear. They called it a trial, But there was no jury, no formal defense, and no opportunity for Richard to plead his case. The hall had been rearranged into something more fitting for a spectacle than a court of justice. Great tapestries hung behind the throne, candles flickered along the walls, and the air was thick with incense, meant to mask the stench of panic and sweat. Richard was brought and not in chains, but flanked by guards with their hands on their hilts. His expression was unreadable, the corners of his mouth neither lifted in defiance nor drawn in fear. He looked around once, slowly, meeting the eyes of each noble. It made them uncomfortable. The king, seated above them all, stared down with a look that blended betrayal with fear. This man had counseled him, guided his court, protected his son. And now they whispered that he was a poisoner, a sorcerer, a traitor. A tall cleric stood and read aloud the accusations: treason, unnatural knowledge, the use of forbidden substances, and conspiracy to murder members of the royal court. No proof was offered, only coincidence, suspicion, and fragments of testimony twisted to fit the fear now gripping the nobility. Richard listened in silence. When asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he spoke only once. "I told you truths no one else dared. That is my crime." That was all. The court erupted. Some cried for his death on the spot. Others demanded exile. But one voice, the king's chamberlain, called for something more symbolic. Something unforgettable. "Let the punishment be as unnatural as the crime," he said. "Let the world see what happens to those who poison the well from which we all drink." It was then that the idea of boiling was raised. Not simply execution. A message. Boiling alive was rare, even in an age where heads rolled easily. It was saved for the vilest crimes, counterfeiting, assassinations of royalty, sorcery. But it had been done before. And the chamberlain, a man who had long distrusted Richard, pressed the idea with veiled words that hinted at divine justice. If Richard was truly a corrupter of life, then let water, the purest element, cleanse his sin. Let the boiling cauldron purify his soul. A brass cauldron was ordered. The court fell silent. There were murmurs of disapproval, discomfort even among those who believed Richard guilty. But none spoke against it aloud. To do so was to align with him, and no one wanted that shadow. Preparations began that very day. In a courtyard rarely used since the last rebellion, workers cleared space. A blacksmith was brought in to shape iron braces. A platform was built, high and wide, with stairs leading up to the vessel. The cauldron itself was imported from Flanders, thick, deep, with a lid large enough to cover a grown man inside. Beneath it, a pit was dug for firewood and coal. Guards stood watch through the night. Richard, meanwhile, remained in the tower. He was not tortured. He was not questioned further. He was simply watched. Those who tended to him said he barely spoke. He asked for no final meal. He took water, nothing else. And yet he slept, peacefully, they said, as if untouched by what waited. Rumors spread again. Some said he had cursed the prince. Others claimed he had been possessed all along, a vessel for something ancient. One guard, normally rational, claimed Richard's shadow moved even when he sat still. Another claimed that in the flicker of torchlight, his eyes glowed faintly gold. By the time the execution day arrived, the crowd was enormous. Nobles came in fine silks, their expressions carefully composed. Servants crowded balconies, eager for something to tell their children, something to fear. Merchants closed their stalls. Even the sick, the crippled, and the old were brought in carts to watch. The fire had already been lit beneath the cauldron. The water inside hissed and bubbled. A blacksmith stood nearby, tools at the ready. A monk paced the platform, reading prayers aloud to no one in particular. When Richard was brought out, the crowd fell silent. He looked thinner than before, paler perhaps, but unshaken. He walked unaided, eyes forward, back straight. No chains. No struggle. At the base of the steps, he paused. Turned to the monk. "The truth does not boil," he said. Then he climbed. The platform groaned under the weight of guards, clergy, and the man himself. A noble stepped forward to read the sentence. He stuttered, visibly uncomfortable, but spoke the words nonetheless. "For crimes against the crown, against nature, and against God, let him be unmade." The blacksmith moved forward, hands trembling, and slowly removed the lid. The steam that escaped was suffocating. Guards reached for Richard. He did not resist. The cauldron stood like a monstrous idol, bronzed, steaming, and gleaming in the morning light. The heat radiating from it warped the air in ribbons, and the crowd, pressed behind wooden barriers, leaned forward as if spellbound by the horror they knew was moments away. They weren't here to witness justice. They were here to witness a spectacle. Richard took one step toward the lip of the cauldron. But before the guards could hoist him in, a voice called out from below. "Let him confess first." It was the king's confessor, a gaunt man in a black robe who stepped forward, crucifix raised. "If his soul is to be boiled, then let his sin be spoken." Richard turned slowly. "You've already judged me," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "But I will say this, the things I taught were truths. Inconvenient, bitter truths. You boiled your own future long before this fire touched me." The priest paled, unsure how to respond. The guards moved again. One on each side gripped his arms. The blacksmith and two others held the lid open, steam rising like spirits escaping from another realm. A hush fell over the courtyard, stillness, like the moment before thunder cracks. And then, Richard stepped willingly into the cauldron. Or so it seemed. In truth, the guards forced his legs up and over, but he did not cry out. He did not scream. He did not plead. The moment he touched the water, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Some covered their mouths. Others turned away. The water didn't react as boiling water should. It churned, but not violently. There was no shriek of flesh meeting heat. No hissing. Just the gentle sloshing of liquid as Richard settled in and sat upright, his eyes fixed forward, steam wreathing his face like some saint in a fevered vision. For a moment, even the king looked uncertain. Was this working? Was he suffering? Then came the sound. A sharp intake of breath. Then another. And another, raspy, unnatural. It wasn't coming from Richard. It was the crowd. Dozens were whispering that Richard was still smiling. Minutes passed. The fire roared hotter beneath the cauldron. More coal was added. The blacksmith checked the structure, sweat pouring down his face. But Richard remained, seated. Unmoving. Unyielding. The nobles fidgeted. Some left their seats. Others shouted for the execution to continue, to make it faster, louder, more final. But how could it be faster? They had already chosen the slowest, most symbolic death known to man. The guards threw in herbs, rosemary, sage, rituals to drive away spirits. Some claimed to see visions in the steam, faces, shapes, the form of a bird flying upward and then vanishing. The monks began to chant. They weren't praying for Richard. They were praying for themselves. The priest who had demanded confession fainted and was carried away. The king's face was a mask of rage now, rage not just at Richard, but at the unease spreading like smoke through his court. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be terrifying, yes, but clean. Final. Powerful. Instead, Richard looked eternal. Then, he slumped. A ripple of movement broke through his shoulders. His head tilted forward. Silence. It took 3 more minutes before anyone dared move. The guards slowly approached, then signaled that it was done. A hook was used to lift the body part way out, limbs stiff and trembling from the heat. The crowd began to leave, though many did so with their heads bowed and mouths tight. The king gave no orders. He simply stood and left, And so ended the life of Richard, once scholar, then heretic, then martyr in the minds of those who feared him most. No monument was ever raised. His body was never buried, its ashes were scattered in secret. But legends sprouted like weeds. That on the night of full moons, steam rises from the courtyard even when the cauldron is cold. That dreams of boiling water now plague the descendants of those who watched. That the truths Richard spoke are still hidden in scrolls locked away beneath the palace. And most haunting of all, that the smile never left his face. The day after Richard's death dawned grim and overcast, as if the sky itself recoiled from the cruelty committed beneath it. Though the execution had ended, its echo continued through rumor, through whispers, and through the lingering scent of smoke that clung to the courtyard stones. No one walked there without glancing toward the center, where the cauldron had stood like a shrine to human fear. But the unease was more than emotional. It became political. Inside the royal court, unease twisted into paranoia. Servants began to resign quietly or vanish without notice. The guards who had handled the cauldron refused to speak of what they had seen. The blacksmith fell into drunken stupors, babbling about Richard's final silence, and how it shouldn't have been possible. One day he disappeared entirely, leaving behind only scorch marks on his workshop floor and a half-forged iron book with no writing on it. The king, too, was changing. Once brash and commanding, he now walked with a weight that sagged his shoulders. His dreams were interrupted by scalding visions, rooms flooding with steam, voices rising from bathtubs, mirrors fogging to reveal Richard's expressionless stare. He had forbidden anyone to speak the heretic's name, but doing so only made the name spread faster, like ink spilled across a forbidden manuscript. It was in this climate that a letter arrived. No seal. No signature. Just fine script burned into aged parchment. One man boiled does not end the truth. You boiled only flesh. The idea remains unwithered. The king ordered the entire royal scriptorium searched. Nothing. He sent his spy master to interrogate every monk in the realm. No one confessed. And yet, over the weeks that followed, more such letters appeared. On the king's pillow. In the chapel. Folded into his meal tray. And then they began appearing outside the palace. Nailed to church doors. Folded into the pockets of merchants. Carried by the wind, it seemed, and always in the same burned script. The message was clear: Richard had become more dangerous in death than in life. And though the king tried to crush the whispers, he couldn't silence the questions now blooming like fire and dry brush. What was it he really taught? Why did he never scream? Why did the cauldron not bubble like before? No one knew, and that made it worse. The church scrambled to reassert control. A new wave of sermons thundered against heresy. Monks rewrote scrolls. Priests warned against the fire-born deception. Yet even the most faithful wavered, for they had seen something in that courtyard that could not be exorcised from memory. Eventually, the king demanded that all copies of Richard's work be burned. All who had studied under him were either silenced or vanished. His belongings were scattered, his family imprisoned. But still, the letters kept arriving. One morning, a boy found a single feather placed atop the cold iron cauldron, left there in secret. That night he vanished. Days later, his family received a scroll with only one phrase: "Truth floats." And then came the dreams, first from the guards who had been present, then from others. Each dream followed the same path. They stood before the cauldron. The fire roared. Steam rose. Richard was there, unmoving, staring. His eyes opened wide, as if seeing beyond the world. And then, without a sound, he lifted a single hand and pointed, not at them, but at something behind them. Every dream ended the same. The dreamer would turn and wake up screaming before they saw what he pointed at. The king stopped sleeping altogether. He took to pacing the halls, muttering about unfinished sentences and boiling thoughts. One day, in front of his ministers, he struck a mirror with his scepter and demanded it show him the truth. When it didn't, he wept. In time, he stopped speaking entirely. He was found one evening in the royal library, surrounded by piles of ash and broken inkpots, scrawling with his own blood across the stone floor. I boiled him. I boiled him. I boiled him, but not his words. They removed him from power the next day. And so Richard's true punishment became clear, not the cauldron, but the ripple. The idea he carried had escaped the heat. It lived on in rumor, in nightmares, in questions asked in secret corners of candlelit rooms. His death had failed to erase him. Instead, it had immortalized him. Years passed, and the name Richard was no longer whispered with fear, but with reverence. His execution, intended to obliterate, had become a legend that could not be quarantined. The boiling had failed. And now, in taverns and temples, in households and among hushed students behind closed doors, people told and retold his tale, not as a caution, but as a symbol. What had once been seen as a crime against the king was now becoming something more complex, a sacrifice. Some even claimed he had chosen silence not from defiance, but from design. That he knew the true power of an idea was not in how loud it was shouted, but in how deeply it lingered. A small cult sprang up in the northern provinces, calling themselves the Hollow Flame. They wore copper rings around their fingers, each engraved with the shape of a single drop. Not blood. Not water. But oil. To them, the cauldron had been an altar. And Richard a martyr. They passed his story not through books but through songs written in unplaceable meters, and in riddles designed to sound foolish to the uninitiated. Their children learned to recite entire speeches by heart, though they never spoke them in daylight. Eventually, one bishop warned the church. We did not boil the man, we distilled him. Meanwhile, in distant courts, foreign kings began to study Richard's trial, not for its justice, but for its symbolism. One ruler of a mountain realm reportedly kept a miniature iron pot on his desk, filled with dried rose petals. To remember, he would say when asked, but he never said what. Then came the resurgence of texts, smuggled fragments believed to be Richard's original writings. One, written in cipher, revealed a simple line once decoded. To boil the body is to lose the scent. But the idea, the rest was missing. Torn. Or perhaps never finished. But the faithful believed he had said all he needed to. The cauldron itself was melted down years later, under orders from the new monarch who wished to end the memory. The metal was recast into bells for a cathedral, but strange was the sound they made. A low, tremulous tone, that seemed to hum even in stillness. Locals called them the whispering bells, and some claimed they rang in fog, even when no wind stirred. Others said they sometimes chimed before nightmares. And as generations turned, the story mutated, as all stories do. To some, Richard became a prophet burned for revealing celestial truths. To others, a rebel who tricked the monarchy by dying silently. Still others believed he had been no more than a man, a teacher who dared to ask, what if everything we've been told is only half the truth? But all versions agreed on one point. He had not screamed. And that silence, louder than flame or steel, became a question that haunted all who remembered him. In time, a monument was raised in a small forest clearing, not by decree, but by devotion. It was not a statue, nor a plaque, but a simple iron basin. Empty. Cool to the touch. And above it, carved into stone. In silence, he taught us. No one ever claimed responsibility for building it. But travelers continued to leave behind tokens, feathers, rings, bits of parchment with half-written thoughts. Some lit candles. Others sat in quiet, trying to feel what he must have felt. The irony, of course, was that Richard had likely wanted none of this. Or perhaps, he had planned every moment. And the greatest terror was not in how he died, but in the unsettling sense that, just maybe, He had wanted to die that way. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood something no one else did. Something even now we haven't quite grasped. Something that still boils beneath the surface. Waiting.